the summertime, and the living is easy. The fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. Oh, your daddy's rich, and your mama, she's good looking. So hush, little baby, don't you cry. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing, and you'll spread your wings way up to the sky. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing, and you'll spread your wings way up to the sky. Until that morning, there ain't nothing to harm you, with Mammy and Daddy standing by. I gotta make up some words, because there's no voice in the monitor. I don't know if it matters, because the music's the most important thing with a little bit of vocal garnish. But I really can't tell if I'm in tune or not. So, I am back in the monitor now. Okay. Ba-do-dum-doo-ee, ba-do-dum-dee, ba-do-dum-doo-ee, ba-do-dum-doo-ee, ba-do-dum-dee, ba-do-dum-doo-ee. We'll see the sky, and you and I, the sky and you and I, oh shades, all blue. Some folks like blue, some folks like green, some folks like colors that you've never seen, all blue, all blues. The colors, shades, all blues. The sea, the sky, and you and I. The sea, the sky, and you and I, all blue. Colors, shades, all blue. The colors, shades, all blue. Okay. While in the Miles Davis vein, there's another one called So What? So this program is called Harvesting Infinity, and I wanted to give a little bit of an example of that musically before I spoke to you. So where did Harvesting Infinity come from anyway? So I have this 5-book series about innovation, innovators, and innovation relationships. And the first book is called Involuntary Innovator, and the last book is called Harvesting Infinity, because after you work your way through the process, you too can harvest infinity. But musically, I was just trying to harvest infinity by something I call a ensemble. That's a one-person ensemble. I was attempting to be 3 people at once, because with technology you can get away with it. My brain can't quite get away with it, but the technology can. And that's really harvesting infinity. If you could be a trio instead of a solo gig, you are more employable. And more than that, it's also sort of fun to be able to play with yourself, no pun intended. But being able to like play bass and piano at the same time and go back and forth and have a conversation, well, that's kind of cool. And you can't really do that without technology. But this is a perfect example of harvesting infinity. If you can do this for one song, you could do it for all of them. Not that it's a good idea to do it for all of them, but I tried to choose ones where the bass player would have a prominent role. That's why I did a couple of Miles Davis things, all blues and So What, because they're known for their bass line. You know, if you just play that line on a piano or a guitar, it does not have the same impact as playing it on a bass. Of course, you don't see any basses in front of you, so it's a little bit mysterious. The keyboard here, this keyboard has no sounds in it at all. It's a MIDI controller. All of the sounds are in this Macintosh, and the bass sounds are samples of bass sounds, and the piano sounds are a mathematical model of a piano. So the keyboard is sending some MIDI information, and the computer is figuring out, I guess you could call it artificial intelligence, which half of the notes to send to the bass player and which half of the notes to send to the piano player. Of course, what it's doing is something called intelligent splitting. So where it chooses to place those notes depends on the context of what you're playing. This is all harvesting infinity kind of stuff. And by the way, the other 3 books, so the first book is Harvesting Infinity, the last book is Harvesting Infinity, the first book is Involuntary Innovator, but the 3 in between are Creative Outliers, Meaning Place, and Innovation Governance. Creative outliers are the people who become innovators. Meaning place is what creative outliers do in order to be able to become innovators. And governance has to do with, well, how do you track what's going on with this technology? And now that AI is a big deal, innovation governance is going to become a lot more important, because we don't quite know how to control what we created, and that could be problematic. Maybe not, but still it should be governed. So coming back to this harvesting infinity, this is really about the inherent unbounded nature of innovation. And I want to point out that we are here in New England, but I spent 25 years in Silicon Valley, and I can tell you from a West Coast perspective that New England is a lot more uptight than California. In terms of innovation, in California, the general attitude is go for it. In terms of being a change agent, the New England thought is more like don't do it. It's risky. And there's an abundance model in California, which is why Silicon Valley is the economic engine driving the entire world, even though New England is the source of many of these technologies that the West Coast has turned into billionaires. So the East Coast had a bunch of mainframe computers like Sperry Rand and all of the companies that gave birth to the mini computers, the original IBM, Big Iron, rooms full of computers. And somehow these mainframe computer people in this scarcity environment, they didn't notice that the mini computer might make sense. So a bunch of mini computer companies came along, Data General, Prime, DEC. None of the people in those companies were the people who were in IBM and Sperry Rand and all of the big companies. Why is that? Well, part of the attitude, this scarcity mentality. And yet, even though they moved from the mainframe to the mini computer on the East Coast, none of these guys believed that the personal computer was a happening thing. So even though DEC, Digital Equipment Corp, invented personal computers called the Rainbow, which had Windows, it had mice, it had 2 operating systems, and they had a search engine called Alta Vista. But what happened to DEC? Well, they essentially got acquired by a microcomputer company, Compaq, because the mini computer company's CEO, even though he was a mathematician from MIT, Kenneth Olson, he thought there was no market for personal computers. So even though DEC invented much of what's in the personal computer, it took the West Coast to turn it into trillion-dollar entities, while DEC got acquired by Compaq, Compaq got acquired by HP, and this has to do with the attitude of scarcity versus abundance. All these East Coast companies invented all these technologies, including, by the way, artificial intelligence. I took classes in artificial intelligence 40 years ago in college. We invented it here on the West Coast, on the East Coast. But the West Coast has created all the companies that are making use of it. So this attitude about scarcity versus abundance, this is a pretty big deal, because if you think that you can't, then you definitely can't. If you think you can, you might also not be able to, but at least you tried. And these East Coast companies got completely passed by and eclipsed by the West Coast companies. But even the West Coast companies, okay, so they thought mini computers was a good idea, but they seem to have missed the notion of the smartphone. So why is it that HP and IBM, none of these companies had smartphones? Apple, which was a teeny little company compared to these giant companies, they decided to exploit it. Again, it was an attitude thing. Guys wearing Hawaiian shirts and river shorts on flip-flops are much more willing to take chances than guys wearing three-piece suits. Guys wearing three-piece suits care about what they look like. Guys who play the ukulele are different than the guys who play grand pianos, unless, of course, you're like an East-West Coast transplant. I've just been exposed to a ukulele bass, and I think it's really cool. So even though I have a grand piano, I think a ukulele bass is in my future. But then again, I'm an involuntary innovator, so my opinion doesn't count. So let's talk about a few different dimensions of this harvesting infinity, since this is the 4th episode in the program about it. First one was that abundance mindset. This is a really big deal. But now that we had a pandemic and we have virtual relationships, this abundance mindset is able to spread beyond geographic boundaries. And it is. And lots of other people are trying to become more Silicon Valley-like in their thinking. Next issue is overcoming the obstacles to harvesting infinity. So let's say you've got the right attitude and you think it's possible and you're going to go for it and you're going to be a change agent. Well, this is not necessarily a guarantee of success. Just because you think you can hit it out of the park doesn't mean that you can. You still can get hung up in your past, which is why third world nations are sometimes passing first world nations, because they don't have any of the tech that we had 50 years ago. So they've all got cell phones and broadband, but they were 10 years ahead of us in getting high-speed networks. Crazy, huh? But here's the most important thought about all this. If you're going to be an innovator or a creative outlier or a change agent or whatever you're going to call it, you've got to get into a feedback loop with reality. That means you have to listen to feedback. You can't just live in your own world and say, I'm doing cool stuff, so I'm going to make it big. You've got to have a set of relationships with other people who tell you whether or not you're nuts. And sometimes they'll be wrong and sometimes they'll be right, but at least you should be having the conversation. So you do need to be able to integrate what other people think. It's a co-creative process. You've got to collaborate to do big things. And here's the last thing. Last thing is, how do you manage all these infinite choices to achieve any kind of mastery? I myself am confused because I play a bunch of different musical instruments. And you just heard me attempt to play the piano and the bass and sing at the same time. And I can tell you that's quite confusing. Even if you think you're a multitasker, how do you manage these choices? How much energy do you give to which choice? You really need to spend some energy on managing your infinite choices. Otherwise, you have so much chaos and entropy that you can't make any decisions, and you have so much clutter, not only in your house from all your stuff, but in your head from all of your thoughts. And that clutter can be really paralyzing. So these are the basic things about harvesting infinity. You need the right mindset. You need to be willing to overcome the obstacles. You need to get into a feedback loop with reality. And you need to figure out how to manage infinite choices. Because if you're trying to harvest infinity, well, you're playing the infinity game now, and that is a different game. Hi, Phil. How you doing?
How, Howard? Good to be with you.
So what do you think we should talk about today? Something to do with the show or whatever?
Oh, yes. Well, you're the host.
Okay.
So we follow you. But creativity seems to be your...
Okay. So here's what this show is called Harvesting Infinity. Has to do with innovation, innovators, innovation relationships. And this particular segment of the show is called Meaning Place, as opposed to Meeting Place, where people meet and they network and they hang out, or the Marketplace, which is about money. Meaning Place is about meaning. And that's why I wanted to talk to Phil, because he has figured out how to make meaning, at least for himself, and a lot of people who read the 25 books he's written. So he knows how to deliver meaning.
Money, not so much.
Money, not so much. So. Me too. Meaning and money are not necessarily that correlated. But since we do live in crazy times, and since Phil's last book was about spiritual practice in crazy times, it's my hypothesis that if you can create meaning, it will help you deal with crazy times. So is that anything?
I agree.
So did your book have anything to do with that?
In part, because one of the things I write about in the book is framing perspective on what's going on and what's disturbing you, what's upsetting you, and reframing, which I guess you could say is giving new meaning or shift of meaning to how you perceive what's going on. There's what's going on, and then there's how we react to it. And part of how we react to it is, what does it mean? What is the perspective? And I think because it's a book about spirituality, taking a big view helps. Even if the big view is just historical. If you're a certain age, you know that we've been through crazy times in the past, and you may have lived through them. That helps, having that perspective. It's like if you're looking out the ground floor window, what you see is not the same as if you climb up to the roof. You have a bigger perspective. So I think part of managing ourselves in crazy times is is there a larger meaning I can hold this in? And therefore take my rage or my worry or my fear and give it a larger perspective so I can convert those reactions, those emotions, into something more constructive, like action or helping others or bringing some calm to a situation.
So there are many spiritual practices, and there's wisdom literature that's been around for a couple of thousand years at least.
More.
Since writing began, at least. And are spiritual practices in general about giving you a larger picture?
No, that's one
Okay.
one piece of it. Otherwise, I mean, my book there's a couple hundred pages, so there's a lot in there. But a lot of it is, to me, the spiritual angle is essentially pointing you inward, so that it's cultivating different state of consciousness or perception. So all the spiritual traditions have what we would call meditative practices, and those to me are terribly critical. And look, bottom line is spirituality, as I address it in my work and in my life, is about enlarging the sphere of what we are and what we think we are, from, I'm Phil and you're Howard, to our connectedness to not just the rest of humanity, but to the cosmos. And, in religious traditions, they call that God, and other traditions, they'll give it different names, different terms for whatever the universal intelligence and energy that runs the show, including us. And we're part of that. So spirituality to me is connecting to that. And when we do, it's transformative. I mean, I first set foot on a spiritual path back in the 60s because I wanted to change my life. And that's become a big part of my life. But in terms of dealing with crazy times, we all have what I call a sanctuary of peace within ourselves. At our deepest level, beyond mind and of feelings and emotions and all that, we have a core of quiet and silence. And to me, the most important aspect of spirituality is engaging in methods that tap into that and secure us in an inner stability and peace. And with that can come a larger perspective, but it's secondary to the feeling of peace and calm. And and people have used that as an escape, going off to the woods and the ashrams and everything. But it's a practical thing. If you're calmer and you're more stable, you can react better to the madness around us and maybe do something useful, as opposed to just vent or worry or
So you're actually going both bigger and smaller than these crazy times. Mm-hmm. This external stuff, you're connecting to the cosmos, something much, much bigger than you, but you're also going internal to your own personal sanctuary.
Which is basically the same thing when you really look at it. I mean, you talk about harvesting infinity. Mm-hmm. Well, the mystics would say the same thing. That, and that the harvesting is a useful thing. You go within. All the spiritual traditions will tell you, go within, get your inner peace, your inner stability, expand your mind, and then come out and be useful. You'll be doing so on a better platform.
So when times are crazy, to have some sort of a way of going within and connecting to the cosmos seems to matter even more, because you can be just buffeted by all of these streams of distractions and all this external stuff. I know for me, I think the world's pretty nuts, and if I couldn't go inside, I would be freaking out.
And people are. And even people who are, regular practitioners of meditation and mindfulness and prayer and yoga and all the other methodologies, we lose it too sometimes, because it is a difficult, challenging time. But your odds are better if you have methods like that, if you have a habit of going inward and finding some peace.
So how about satsang? How about a community of spiritual practitioners? Because as you say, we lose it. But if you do it with a group, you're more likely to...
Quite right. No, you're absolutely right. And every spiritual tradition has, Buddhists call it sangha. In the West, we call it a congregation, right? Mm-hmm. You know, community is terribly important, and it's missing a lot in the world now with everybody so mobile and leaving their communities of where they were born and raised, leaving family. I think that's a big need that we have now. Maybe, you know, we can come together around issues like climate change and fear of fascism, and maybe there are secular communities that can be integrated into the spiritual kind of community.
So community used to be thought of as primarily a local thing. People were in touch with each other. But we had a pandemic a few years ago, and everybody went virtual, and we now have the technology to transcend our physical proximity and maybe permit us to go for some ideational proximity instead.
Yeah.
And many people have meaningful relationships with people who live nowhere near them.
I know. It's a phenomenal thing, and it's very useful and it's very practical. I've been doing online courses and workshops, and it means I can reach people who live in different parts of the world, which is terrific. On the other hand, there's something about being together in person. I'm here a couple of feet from you, looking you in the eye, seeing your body language, seeing your facial expressions. On screen, it's a little different. And 20 little boxes on screen. And if you're lucky enough to have 50 or 80 and you have to flip screens to see all the people, it's not quite the same.
So can there be spiritual community that's more virtual, that's distant?
It seems to be happening. We'll see in time whether they're as effective. I mean, look, like everything else, Howard, you understand technology and innovation better than most. And you know that for every blessing, there's a dark side. So this virtual world is a blessing, but it has its dark side.
20 years ago when I was a professor, we started to explore distance learning. And it was terrible. It just was no good at all. It wasn't satisfying for the students. It wasn't satisfying for the professors. But now it's actually getting better. And now you can take a class with somebody who you've never met, that's on the other side of the world.
Right.
And it can be quite useful. So I think what we need
and you can pause, and you can rewind, and you could stop and take a screenshot of the graphic. You can't, in a classroom, may not be able to do that.
So it seems like we need a hybrid solution, which is part in person and part at a distance. And even if people are primarily at a distance, but they get together once in a while, that they could stay synced up.
Yeah.
And then they could tell more about each other when they're being virtual.
I hear there are academic programs that are trying for exactly that.
So to change topics a little bit, now that we could transcend our geography, which is pretty cool, there's still this business of you can create meaning for yourself, you can connect to the cosmos, you can ignore the craziness that's outside. But if you're a creative person, you still have to figure out how to make a living too. And while you're being true to yourself, that is not necessarily correlated to paying the bills in any way. And I heard you say once that there were kind of like two choices you could...
Yeah.
What are those two choices?
Well, what I was saying was when most of my work over the last several decades has been as a writer. And if I define myself, I'm primarily a writer. I'm most comfortable and most satisfied sitting and playing around with words and sentences and so forth. So when you're a young aspiring writer, you get two kinds of advice. especially if you aspire to screenwriting, but also commercial writing in the book world or magazine world. One will say, be very savvy, be very market driven, do your research, analyze the market, see what people want, and work to give it to them. And other people say, don't think about that stuff. That's for Philistines. You're a creative soul. Write what comes naturally to you. Write what makes you, what brings passion to your life. Write what's satisfying creatively, and the market will follow. And, people can do well following either of those, and people can go totally astray following either of those. I've seen people do the marketing thing, but they're always a step behind and doesn't work out. And I've seen people, of course, following their passion and writing what they want, and no one reads it, or no one wants to publish it because it's either not good enough or it doesn't have a market. So somewhere along the line, I realized I have to do both. I can't be I can't be snobbish about being a creative person and ignore the marketplace, ignore the commerce end of it. Writing is a solitary thing, but somewhere along the way, you need an agent and an editor and a publisher and a sales staff and all the rest if you want to be read. And they are bottom line driven. At the same time, if you're only market driven and you don't pay attention to your craft and you're writing stuff you don't care about, it's not going to be satisfying.
So just like we needed a hybrid solution between the virtual and the in-person for community, you also need a hybrid solution to be true to your own creative muse and your ideas, but to be opportunistic enough to realize that sometimes things can be commercialized.
Sure.
And then you need to do that same kind of balancing act, that hybrid act too.
If you want to be read or heard, if you're a musician, if you just want to write for the satisfaction of writing, you can write. But if you want to be read and you want to reach people, then you have to think about the sometimes unsettling aspect of, how do I do that? And how do I reach them?
So you've written a lot of books, and some of them are your own stuff, and sometimes you've ghostwritten for other people.
Yeah.
Is the ghostwriting one of these kind of hybrid trade-offs between...
Oh, yeah, I got into ghostwriting at a certain point when my own stuff wasn't paying the bills, and it was fortuitous. People asked me to help them with books, and I did, and I resented it. I didn't want to have to do it. But then I realized, well, that's better than, what else? There's other ways writers make a living until they can make a living from their own writing. At least I was able to write and learn my craft better and learn the publishing business better. So I did ghostwriting from time to time. And I have to say, looking back, I met the most interesting people. I learned a tremendous amount about things I never would have known. So it turned out to be more satisfying and more creatively satisfying than I anticipated. At first it was just like, it's a gig. And there's compromises. You can't always. Some people are lucky. They start writing what they feel and what matters to them, and they are commercial success. And they can make a life writing from their soul and being paid for it. But most often, people along the way, we have to make compromises. We have to say, I have to pay the bills. Thank you for the offer. I'm great, and I'll get the job done. One of my books, American Veda, which is probably what I'm best known for, that was a work of nonfiction, but it was a subject I was passionate about and loved researching, learning so much. And when I contracted with Random House to finish the book and work on it, I realized I got so much work to do. How am I going to pay the bills along the way until the book is done? And as it happened, someone asked me to ghostwrite a book. And so I went to Random House and I said, can I have an extra 6 months on my deadline so I can do this? And I realized how lucky I was, because I had this gig and I got it done, and it enabled me to write my own book comfortably without having to, do too many other things to pay bills. So sometimes the two efforts, the two aspects of what turned out to be a large part of my writing career, complemented one another.
And American Veda is so interesting that even the titles of the chapters themselves.
Thank you.
Actually,
I'm proud of those.
You get a lot out of just reading the chapter titles.
I'm not always good with titles, chapter titles, subheads. Sometimes it drives me nuts, but I'm proud of the ones in that book.
I like them.
Yeah.
And it also seems like you did find meaning in the ghostwriting.
At times. There was times when it was just routine. It was an exercise in craftsmanship, and that's valuable. But there are times, I learned a tremendous amount. I ghosted a couple of books with business leaders, and I had no interest in business, but I learned a tremendous amount about leadership, about decision making, about managing other human beings, because these were good people running big organizations, and they were writing useful books and helping them. I ghosted a book with a great athlete, Rafer Johnson, who, if you're a certain age, you remember he was, cover of Sports Illustrated. He was a great athlete, but also had a political life after his retirement, and was one of the people close to Bobby Kennedy. And I can't tell you how much I learned, working on his autobiography. But it's not the same as doing your own work or writing a novel.
So to kind of end things, tying it all together, it seems like you do need to be true to yourself, but you also have to be flexible and adaptive, and whether it's called creative or harvesting infinity, and you need to sort of connect to the cosmos and be able to go within. And you've managed to do this for a long time. So you did create meaning. Sometimes things were not inherently meaningful, but you found some ways to derive some meaning from them. And it seems like the message of this is it's not just A or B, it has to be A plus B.
Yes, and sometimes what we think are compromises are actually, blessings. I came to see that. I didn't always see it while I was doing it. It was like, I should be writing my own stuff, and why doesn't the world recognize my greatness, And I have to do this silly ghostwriting. But, it turned out to be, a wonderful kind of thing. And it freed me so I could write my novel, and I'm now writing a sequel to that novel, and that's the most satisfying creative work
That's
I've
great.
done.
So to find out more about Phil, philgoldberg.com?
Phillip.
philipgoldberg.com. With one L. This program is called Harvesting Infinity. It has to do with creativity as it applies to innovation and innovators and innovation relationships. I think this here is an innovation relationship that we're having. And the segment of the program that we're in right now is called Composer's Corner, because I think composers are a group that I feel kind of closer to than a lot of other creative groups. And it's very difficult to be a composer in the world right now. It's a hard thing to do. So how about if we start a little bit with your musical upbringing? Because people don't usually start as composers. They start as piano players or something else. But how did you become a composer?
Yes, I sometimes wonder how I ended up here and whose fault it was, but probably myself to blame. Hi there, Howard, and hi to everyone. Great to speak to you. Firstly, well, I'm like I said, I'm about to turn 51, so I haven't had, not years and years in the industry, but enough experience to know I probably made the choice that would upset my parents. But there it is. Anyway, I studied composition at the University of Pretoria. So I actually did my undergraduate degree in composition, and I finished that in '96. And then I actually stopped composing for a while, mostly because I had to earn a living, and and then I focused more on performance as a choral conductor and a choral singer. Um, and that was for quite a long time. And I actually did my master's degree in performance in conducting. But since then, I've always loved composing, and I've decided to return to it, especially over the COVID era where we couldn't have choirs, of course. And it 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 sort of just rekindled this spark in me. It's just in some ways it's the complete opposite of performing, because it's solitary. You've just got yourself and the piano and the score, and it's and I think I'm quite lucky in that I have both of these aspects of music. But I would say that I started composing really when I was a kid, when I was a chorister in New York at a choir school. So some of your viewers might know St. Thomas School in Fifth Avenue, or that's the church in Fifth Avenue, and it's or Episcopal school. It's the Anglican school. And I was a treble, and we sang it was wonderful, really wonderful, and all the usual repertoire, which was mostly English, but also music by Mozart, Bach, Palestrina, the early composers. So I think for me, I didn't have any formal training back then, of course, but I think the way to learn it is to just do it. I know Gustav Holst had the best advice for any young composer, because teaching composing I'm not sure how you really do it. You can teach the craft of composing, and all he said was spoil as much music paper as possible. That's it. And he's right. He was right. I mean, that is the only way to do it. Sit at the piano and just write a note, and then play that note on the piano, and then that grows into 2 notes and 3 notes. And before you know it, you've got a bar. And then you extend that, and then you change it, and that's how you do it. A chaotic and haphazard way of going about it, I think. And then eventually the thing becomes some sort of form. You might decide on a rhythm or something like that. But I think before I started studying composing formally, I think, I just spoiled as much music paper as possible.
So I want to interrupt you describing your musical upbringing to focus on what you were just talking about, because the world has changed a lot in that regard. We have new sets of tools that we didn't have at all when we started. And I'm wondering, when I started at Juilliard, they basically said, forget that you know anything technological at all and just use a pencil and paper. Let's take you back to do it the way that Bach did it. And as an electrical engineer, that was kind of hard for me to do. But now, how have you integrated some of these new capabilities into your workflow? Because they're so powerful that you can't ignore them anymore. But you still do lose something because you can get too caught up in the technology, and then it interferes with your creative process and your artistic judgment. So how are you doing this balancing act of being a modern composer with a traditional background? So it's my opinion that our unconscious mind is smarter than our conscious mind, and some of the best stuff I do is when I'm in a flow state, and when my brain gets too much in the way, then I stop flowing. So the technology is powerful and it's cool, but it frequently gets me knocked out of flow state because I have to attend to technical details. So as a contemporary composer who is aware of artificial intelligence type tools that you use, how do you juggle this sort of staying in the artistic flow with also taking advantage of some of these great capabilities?
Well, for me, it's actually very simple. I don't compose at the computer. I compose with pen and paper at the piano or at my electric piano. And only after that's done, then I make a few notes on the score to say, well, I always write in piano score or to piano score or something like that. And then I play through it, make a few corrections or adjustments, and only then do I go to the computer. And then it's a matter of putting down the entire score on piano, on the Sibelius or whatever it is, and then listening to it, and then I make a few balance corrections. But I'm quite aware that if when you do that, you're making the balance adjustments not for real musicians, but you're making it for Sibelius, so that you can just hear it played back properly. So I have to be careful with the technology in the sense that a musician will see something and it says forte, but he will in a rehearsal situation, he'll know that the forte in Mozart is not the same as the forte in Mahler. So obviously he's not going to play it in the same way. But obviously when you're at the computer, you have to be quite specific. So I think there can be the danger of someone like me who writes rather large orchestral scores sometimes, in that the score looks absolutely crazy. There are more dynamics than notes, or there's so much articulation that the musician might, well, not quite feel inhibited. I mean, there's a long tradition of it, but will not automatically adjust to the acoustic conditions he's playing in. So for me, that's the only safeguard. But I have to be disciplined, because it is very easy for me to sit in my warm office and compose at the computer. Now, if it's something very simple, like an arrangement of a hymn or something, yes, sure, then I can do it at the computer. But when you're doing creative work, you have to write so quickly. And if you're worrying about a keyboard and a pen and balance and headphones and and then your emails open and things like that, quite right, it disturbs the workflow, and you're just going to end up writing it in a not in a very spontaneous manner.
So you are both a composer and a performer. And so there are three things that you're juggling. There's the tech, how does Sibelius interpret the dynamics? And there's what do you want to write? But as a musician, you're also sensitive to, well, what can musicians process? So it's not only Sibelius has its peculiar way of processing things, so do real people. So you've got really three different versions in your head.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is, with my scores, even something that looks relatively simple on paper is never simple when it comes to rhythm. I think we've spoken about this before, but or tempo, shall I say, not rhythm, but tempo. And a real musician, an actual musician, no matter what level they're at, they will naturally feel that a note needs to be slightly held, or this needs to push on slightly. I mean, you don't have to tell them, they all feel that. But obviously with Sibelius being very literal, you have to make minute adjustments. And sometimes I find myself writing, 3 different tempo indications within one bar just to get the thing to sound like a human would, who would do it unconsciously. Now, of course, why am I doing that? The only reason I feel I have to do it myself is that with these very large scores, as a composer in a very crowded marketplace, and as an obscure South African, of course, I think when I put these videos, these MIDI demo files on YouTube or something, then I feel that I almost have to perform it. It's kind of you have to take a step back. And actually, the more time you spend on it, and these things do take a lot of time, you can get a little bit of distance, which is nice. And instead of littering my scores with lots of indications, like tempo indications specifically, you can demonstrate what it sounds like in your head to someone who might be interested in performing it. So yeah, it is a lot of work, but I think I have to be quite disciplined and keep the technological side away from the actual pen and paper bit.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why your compositions sound so great. When I first heard the things you were writing, I'm still pretty amazed that Note Performer and Sibelius are able to do that. So you have a different level of attention to detail. And I have found the scores to be somewhat inadequate at capturing what needs to be expressed. And not only are you juggling the three different things of the composer and the performer and the technology, but different instruments deal with phrasing in different ways too. So even in the score, how do you indicate a phrase versus bowing versus, so the phrasing for a piano and the phrasing for a string section and the phrasing for the horns, that's not the same too. So this is a very multidimensional process that you're having to ride herd over.
Oh yes, yes, and I mean I think with something like that, you get used to the program, to the process. The nice thing about Sibelius is that you can solve that problem by making the slurs invisible. So what you can do is write, yeah, well, for me, I work on a PC, so it is Shift Control H, and then you can hide you can actually hide all sorts of things. You can hide notes, articulation, dynamics are the most important, because sometimes when you have a long note in the violin, you will want a little bit of a crescendo, and of course with Note Performer, with a crescendo comes a little bit more vibrato, so they warm the note up, and then a diminuendo to the end of the note, and so you can hide all that stuff. And the nice thing is when you click on the bar, when you highlight the bar, it'll show you those sort of things in a almost like a little ghost note. And so you can see that, you can change it, you can highlight those things. So the score itself has quite a lot of detail in it, but you wouldn't give that to a musician because, like you said, to a violinist, when you put a phrase mark in, it means you play it with the same bow, and you're not going to do that. But and then you'll have different articulation of the same phrase in the woodwinds. That means a breath for them, tonguing or slurring, as they call it. But yeah, so Sibelius, well, all these programs, I guess, they have clever ways of hiding all the myriad bits of information. And of course, before I put that score this morning, as you said, on YouTube, or whatever it is, you can actually select all the dynamics and then press hide, and that's it. Or all the tempo indications, and then you hide. Yeah.
I knew Sibelius had a hide command, and I've used it to hide entire staves of music, but
yes.
It didn't occur to me the level of granularity of the hide. You could hide at a very, very detailed level, which means you could make the score more performer friendly. I don't mean Note Performer, I mean the actual living performer. So you don't have to get them all fouled up with all this extraneous information, but you can micromanage the software by giving it the level of detail to get a compelling performance. That's why your pieces are sounding so much better than the score looks. I've noticed when you're strolling that you show us the score, and I listen to what you're doing, and I go, wow, that's fantastic. How is it interpreting that? And that's because a lot of the things that you're telling it to interpret are not visible. Fascinating.
Exactly. And the other thing I can do is, for example, if I write a lot for organ and voice, and if you have something like a string stop, you can do that. But on the organ, you have something like an octave coupler, which means that the organ will play not only the notes you're playing, but up an octave. Now, you don't want that to be too loud. So what you can do is at that point, you just add an extra violin stave and copy that line, put it up an octave, and make it pianissimo, pianissimo, pianissimo. So it's got 6 P's on it. So in Sibelius, what you'll get is this kind of shimmer effect. So you'll get that kind of almost glassy, ethereal effect, very softly. That's almost imperceptible. That is the way that an organ would operate with certain stops. So there are all sorts of tricks. I mean, I'm very lazy. I can tell you that. I'm lazy when it comes to technology. I'm not too lazy when it comes to actually composing. So there are all sorts of shortcuts. I mean, there's a proper way to do something like that. You'd have to export it into something like Logic or something, and then you can manipulate those sounds in every single bar. But yeah, it's not. That takes a lot of time for me.
So you are not only using the software for capture and for editing, you are using it for mixing as well.
Yes. Well,
and
exactly.
Mixing at a
yes.
And you're mixing at a more detailed level than just the sliders on the mixer by hitting M in Sibelius. You're actually mixing within the staves by different dynamics for different instruments, or you're almost like controlling the overtones separately from the fundamentals.
That's exactly it. And for example, I can tell you, for example, on Note Performer, if you have a string section and you have the first violin, second violins, violas, cellos, and double bass, the contrabasses or double basses are going to sound a lot louder. Now, if you go to the mixer function and turn it down, well, then it's going to be a blanket mix down. So you don't want that. So what I could do is say all the instruments play at mezzo forte, and then the double bass will play at piano with a crescendo, and then a diminuendo or something like that. And then you hide the dynamics, and then just before you write the piano, you write mezzo forte, and that's visible. But because it comes before the actual dynamic, the piano cancels out the mezzo forte. But what the performer sees is mezzo forte, and he knows to blend.
So you are actually using your conducting skills to conduct the computer, as well as to conduct the musicians.
That's exactly it. So, this can get rather philosophical, as you know, Howard, because if you think of the definition of romanticism, I think one of the things that the Romantics were trying to get at, although not at this level, but certainly in philosophy, if you look at the early 20th century, Mahler, Schoenberg, Richard Strauss, and these guys, if you look at their scores, they're so incredibly complex. I mean, really unprecedentedly complex, to the extent that the musicians who played under them were complaining about this. They said, well, these guys don't give us any artistic freedom, which is true. I mean, you have a large orchestra. There isn't much freedom, of course, and that was their attempt at doing what I'm doing. Is this that music is less of a group interpretive activity and more of an expression of what the conductor can divine from the universe. And even the composer, not the conductor, the composer. And even there, the composer is sort of taking dictation from some metaphysical source, and not composing it, but choraling it. He's just the vessel, and he writes it down. So it goes into Nietzsche and all sorts of things. It gets pretty heavy. But in some ways, Sibelius and this sort of technology is the ultimate form of romanticism. If I spend enough time conducting my own piece using these functions on Sibelius, I am kind of prejudicing the composer, the conductor that will hear it into that's another level of getting him to take my interpretation as authoritative. So the score and the MIDI file become almost synonymous or almost equal in weight, and therefore the composer can, you can have your instinct, your musical instinct, and your musical feeling, not only on paper, but directly into sound, and that is unprecedented. And I think that is actually what the effect of technology is that it's not just a representation on score, but it's a representation in sound. And I think the only precedents for something like this are actual recordings. And of course that's expensive, whereas with me it doesn't cost anything. And then the only other precedent I would say is something like Musique Concrète, Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry and people like that from the early 20th century who would write directly onto magnetic tape. Or someone like Edgar Varèse, who would actually, his piece of music He could write things that were only electronic pieces. So his tone poems and things were written for loudspeakers. There is no score. And in a way, you're kind of doing that. It's just a lot easier, of course.
There are so many different directions to take this conversation, and that I'm going to actually give you a choice. I have three different directions that this could go in, at least. One is you can combine a MIDI performance, because you're a piano player, with the scoring. And I actually wrote a piece for the Chicago Symphony where I played the piano part on a weighted keyboard, but I wrote out the scores for the string quartet and the rest of the instruments, and people said, how did you get the piano to sound so good? Well, I played it. So I combined me performing on a keyboard the MIDI with the scoring. So that's one direction, this combination of the audio file and the MIDI and the score. And two other directions, because of what you mentioned you might want to talk about, a lot of different style. Yeah. So different musical influences make these trade-offs in very different ways. Pop music and jazz and classical music and the medieval plain chant. And then
absolutely.
And then the third path, because I'm going to let you pick which path you want to go down or how you want to connect them. This connection between music, art, literature, and architecture. Because this is, at a philosophical level, you're trying to express things that cannot be expressed completely in words, which is why you're in another art form. But yet there are other ways of representing these feelings too. So those are three different possible paths. You can take one or two or three or combine them, whatever you feel like talking about.
Sure. Well, thank you. Yes, well, I think let me do the last two, and I can address the first one rather quickly. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I hope the TV crew doesn't mind too much, but I'm in this wonderful cathedral here, and this is sort of sometimes irreverently called it my office, which is rather nice. But it's it's a cathedral in Bloemfontein, and it was built in 1863. So if you want to talk about the connection between music and architecture, well, I'll quickly show you something.
So you've got an organ in your office.
I've got an organ in my office. I've got an altar in my office too, choir pews, and right at the back of the church, you can probably just make it out, that baptismal font, that rather grand structure at the back, which, by the way, if anybody is a fan of Lord of the Rings, then they might not know that J.R. Tolkien was actually born in Bloemfontein and baptized in this cathedral in 1897. He was baptized in that font, so we have a nice connection. But you can probably see behind me, 1863, combination of neo-Gothic and neo-Romanesque architecture. There is no way that any person, let alone a professional musician, cannot be in this church twice a week for 15 years, in my case, and not be influenced by the architecture. So, for example, if you look at the arch behind me, it's that what goes up must come down, but it's done in a very decorated and lovely manner. And these recurring motives, which in architecture it's also called rhythm, of course, because the architecture will need to be supported, and the bays and the windows, the stained glass. Got some rather nice. There we go. Some stained glass up there. All 19th century has a sense of rhythm. So for me, architecture, especially ecclesiastical architecture, is almost like frozen music, or music is like architecture, but in sound. And I think that's quite right. That term has been denigrated a lot by some postmodernists, but I think it's true. The height of a place, the way that the building speaks, because we all have our ideas. I mean, I've got my ideas and I put them on Sibelius, but ultimately the main instrument that anybody plays is the acoustics. You can have the best orchestra, you can have the Berlin Philharmonic or the LA Phil or Jimi Hendrix and his band for that matter. And if the acoustics are bad, well, you're not going to get a performance. And for me, it's the practicalities of adjusting to the particular resonant notes within the building. So for this one, for example, you won't be able to hear it, but the acoustics always the note always comes back just a little bit flat from the top. So you have to adjust to that. And it took me about 2 months, but I adjusted to it. And it's just peculiarities like that.
So,
but I mean, the book does have nice acoustics, but yeah.
So I know you have a lot more to say about this, but I need to throw two things in. Do you know the name Buckminster Fuller?
Yes.
He once wrote that writing about music was like roller skating about architecture.
About architecture, that's right. Absolutely.
So
yes. Well, I absolutely agree with that. And there's a famous example, probably one of the most egotistical musicians, and there are a lot of them, composers, as Richard Wagner, the great operatic composer. And the thing about Wagner, he was a very controversial character for all sorts of reasons. Let's not go into them here. But he wrote literally thousands of letters, some of them rather vulgar and distasteful, and many articles on music, hundreds of them, many of them very unfortunate, terrible things that he said. Anyway, we have all this. And he wrote about what a great person he was, and how great his music was, and how he would conquer the world through this music and that sort of thing. Very grandiose. But in all those thousands of pages, do you know what he never wrote about? He never wrote about the process of music, because I don't think that he understood the process of composition himself, and none of us do. Because he was such an egomaniac, he would have written about it. You can be sure, because he loved talking about himself. He would have written about that. And yet he always goes around that. He talks about everything except, how did I write Tristan and Isolde? You know, and yeah, because he understood it would be like roller skating about architecture. That's exactly what he would have said. Yeah.
So one more thought in this vein about bringing it back to acoustics. When I was 10, I was recruited by Juilliard for early admission to become a composer, but I didn't go. I became a physicist, and I majored in acoustics. And the reason I became an acoustician is because I was so wondering, how does sound have such a profound impact on me and everybody? So I spent the next 10 years in college studying electroacoustics, underwater acoustics, airborne acoustics, digital signal. I've been to college for 10 years studying everything I could learn about sound waves. And I came to the conclusion that even the experts aren't, because they can fill up all of these equations on all the whiteboards and all of the theses, but the equations do not describe what happens. What happens musically and sonically and the impact upon us is mysterious. It's a bridging of the art and the science. So I have now come back to composing after spending 40 years as a musical acoustician. And I still don't know the answers, but it's fascinating, the interactions of all of these dimensions. So I do agree with you that I play very different if, let's say, I'm playing an outdoor concert or an indoor concert. I play it completely differently because the acoustics change what you have to do. I play differently in a small room and a large room. I play differently in the winter when people's overcoats are on their chairs and it's absorbing a lot of high frequencies. So I find that the spatial distribution of energy and the frequency response of the environment have a profound impact on sound. And I think for most of us, it's fairly unconscious. It affects us and we do things, but we don't know exactly why and what and how. And that's even after 10 years of studying it in 3 different universities. So
Of course. I mean, if professional musicians had all the answers, why do we need to do sound checks? And in venues that we played in many times, that's how it is. You're adjusting to whatever it is. And I mean, of course, besides the acoustics, like you said, in winter when people have their coats and and things like that. And of course, another practical thing that maybe people don't think about is that there are very few live concerts that are recorded during in the northern hemisphere. It would be between November and January, I guess, because in those months people have colds and they're coughing and sniffing through concerts, and so all of them, there has to be during good weather when not too many people are sick. So yeah, I mean the acoustics they affect everything, and I think that perhaps one of the composers who really addressed this, although he did it in a very witty and philosophical way, was John Cage. And some people might write him off as a charlatan, and it doesn't matter. No matter what you think of his music, that when he said there's no such thing as silence, he said you even go into an anechoic chamber and you can start to hear your blood circulate. I mean that's amazing, and it's all these unpredictable factors that become part of the performance, and no matter how much we try and isolate it and write our scores to be specific in that, if you're sitting in a concert hall having a transcendent experience, but somebody's cell phone goes off or there's a leaf blower a block away or something, that unfortunately becomes part of the performance. And I think Cage, even 50, 60 years ago, was addressing this in a very serious way to say that all sound is music.
And of course, he wrote that famous piece about silence.
Yeah, 433. Yeah, absolutely.
So, as a composer, some composers just write their music and they throw it over the fence and they don't know who the performers are going to be.
Yeah.
So that's hard for me as a person who's played in smaller ensembles, because depending on who's playing first violin, I'm going to make a different line. But what about acoustically? When you compose, do you also think about where it's going to be played? Because you've been composing a mass and you know it's going to be played in your church, and that must sort of help you decide how you're composing. What are you doing? Because you know where it's going to be played.
Well, absolutely. And church music is quite interesting, because a lot of the time there's a kind of agreement that, especially if you're writing an organ part, that if it doesn't work, you change it, you revoice it according to the instrument you have, or something like that, because these people who write for sacred music or church music, they're usually church musicians themselves, and so they will know about all the variables. So you take the directions with a bit of a pinch of salt, and of course, if it's not necessarily professionals, then that the sopranos might just need a little bit of help. It's a long phrase, so you need to speed it up very slightly. Or, in an expressive moment, the baritone soloist will just need a little bit of extra time to really, pronounce the T at the end of that phrase or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, you try sometimes not to be terribly specific. The articulation, and this is where you go to style, of course, because if you look at Bach, it's exactly what you were saying. Bach's music is quite free of articulation marks and not even that many dynamics, but because he was performing it himself, you just had to tell the musicians, well, come on, guys, or he indicated it by the way he was conducting or something. But obviously, as orchestras grow, and you start to see this with Beethoven, because he was deaf, of course, and so he couldn't hear what the orchestra was doing. So he had quite an influence on the way that music was written, just in the way that the score appeared. If you look at the music of Beethoven, and then you look at his earlier music when he was a young man and before he went deaf, his earlier music looks more like Mozart or Haydn. It's relatively few dynamic indications, but then his personality changes when he becomes deaf. Of course, he knows he's a great musician, and he feels hard done by with fate, and so but he's kind of desperate to get this music out, but he has to control it himself, because there's so many ways of interpreting this thing that he kind of takes hold of of what the conductor is going to do by saying, no, this is going to be piano, this is going to be mezzo forte, the crescendo will come here. And I think the musicians of the time must have felt a little bit offended by this, because they thought, well, we've been playing for decades, we don't need your indications. We know how this music should go because it was the general classical style. But of course, he was Beethoven. So really that's the beginnings of Romanticism. And now we end up with Sibelius, things like that. And of course, speaking of style, as you mentioned, it's funny when you ask composers about their style, they're equally kind of, roller skating about the architecture, because I think that you're composing whether you're in a shopping center listening to the Muzak while in the tills waiting to check out, and that sort of music that has a slow beat because they want you to slow down, spend more time, be more relaxed and buy more of their products. You are composing. If you go home after the shopping trip, you are going to have a reaction to that somehow. The music you're listening to in your car, or you drive past, if you live in a noisy area with a nightclub, it's all going to affect it somehow. And that's why I think it's interesting with influences. And I can certainly speak about myself anyway. I study formal music, classical music, analyzing the German Romantic instrumental music. That's how I was trained. But at the same time at church, you're singing English music, which operates quite differently to German music. The style is different. I know we're running out of time, so I can't go into too much. But essentially, the phrase structure of English music is quite different to German music, just because of the language. Because in German you have the verb at the end of the sentence. Everything's going to drive towards the cadence, and that's how we get the 1-6-4-5-1 formula that exists in Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Schubert, Schumann, etc.
And jazz.
In English, and jazz, absolutely. But in English music, because it's subject, verb, object, that is why the climax of a phrase comes relatively early, followed by a long wind down, because you've already said the action word, and everything else will be relaxed. And that's why English music, so even within the Western tradition or whatever it is, that you're going to get these differences because of language. And so for me, who listens to, analyzes Beethoven as a student, but I also worked as an amateur DJ in the 90s. That was great fun. I never got paid for it, but it was a great social thing. And I think I got invited to about 50 21sts of people I didn't know. And I just played, and it was a great social thing. And I dragged my stereo there and had a great time. So that was 92, 93, 94. And it was wonderful. And I would say that if I look at some of the music I compose nowadays, and I'm talking about my serious church music, there are phrases there, and I think, oh boy, that is Michael Jackson, or that is Whitney Houston, or that is Lionel Richie. And I hope these guys never find, or the Pet Shop Boys, or something, as much as Plain Chant, or Beethoven, all the high-minded stuff, or Vaughan Williams, or Herbert Howells, or Gustav Holst, or whatever it is. Yeah, the pop music it's in there, and I'm proud to say it is. It's great music.
Well, as you mentioned, I think we're over time, so we need to bring it in for a landing. But I'd love to do this again because we have a lot more to talk about. We just started half a dozen conversations that we can't end them all. But I think we have to end this one right now. So thank you, Lance Phillip. You have a YouTube channel too. Just search for Lance Phillip.
Lance Phillip with 2 L's, Phillip. Yeah, that's it.
And this was really great talking to you. And now I understand why the pieces you've played for me sound so great with so little information in the score. It is in the score. It's just hidden.
It's just hidden. Yeah.
Fabulous.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. It's been a great pleasure. And thank you to you and to the TV crew, to Erica and to the cameraman. I really appreciate the opportunity and the platform.
Okay, talk to you. And will we be seeing you tomorrow?
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Okay, see you tomorrow morning. Okay,
Thanks
bye-bye.
so much.
Later.